Welcome, everybody. I've been asked to introduce Annie Proulx, but how necessary is that? The 350 people who are here will certainly not have come to this meeting because there was a writer with an interesting French name. Perhaps, or no, 1,500 people were in Groningen when Annie Proulx held the Van der Leeuw-lezing there the day before yesterday. And Annie Proulx has sold hundreds of thousands books in the Netherlands, from the shipping news to her latest short story selection, Close Range. The better question is then, why is Annie Proulx so popular in Holland? It is not because her books resemble the kind of books that get sold in the Netherlands, that are usually sold in the Netherlands. She writes no generational family novels like Anna, Hannah and Johanna or The House of the Spirits. Mrs. Proux's books are often about families, but these are not the kind of relatively normal families that Marianne Fredriksson or Isabel Allende write about. Annie Proulx writes no autobiographical novels like the Dutch novels E.M. or Dubbelliefde. Mrs. Proulx tells stories, she spins yarns, all with the eye and the pen of the historian and the journalist she was raised to be. She writes non-confessional novels and still is popular in the Netherlands. It is not because she creates characters you can easily identify with. For example, the main character in her first novel, Postcards, is a man who murders his girlfriend and then is followed on his way through the States, and who could identify with lots of the people in her latest selection of short stories, Close Range. It is also not because of her vivid descriptions of landscape or nature. Dutchmen live in a country in which there is hardly any nature. We have a famous poet who said, "What is nature in this land? It's a piece of forest as big as a newspaper." And Dutchmen have usually very little patience with writers who are fond of nature. Annie Proulx is, as we know. It is not that Annie Proulx is so popular because of her Western touch. The Western touch that is so clear in her latest book. She has a love for the American West, for the people, and for the scenery. But if you look at another writer who has this, Cormac McCarthy, one of the favorites of Mrs. Proulx, he gets very little read in Holland. A great writer, writes about the West, about other things, but not very popular in Holland. So it's not that. Why then? Well, first of all, it is because Annie Proulx is a great storyteller. She is mining an inexhaustible treasure. See Accordion Crimes, in which she deals with the American immigrant experience in dozens of stories, literally dozens of different stories. And the same is done in Close Range. It is perhaps also because of her incredible expressive style. She is ruthless in her descriptions of ugly and other people. She is original in the way she tells her story. She uses really unforgettable metaphors in all of her books and stories. And she is able to match the beauty of rural America in words and phrases, which is a great thing for a writer. It is also because of the description of a world that is completely different that we probably love the books of Annie Proulx. It is a fascinating world she writes about: rugged workers, little criminals, cruel farmers, psychopaths, losers, etc., etc. But it is best to stick with the answer Mrs. Proulx gave herself. When I asked her this question, why is it that you're so popular in Holland, whereas all these things are against it? And we were sitting at a table in an Italian restaurant where we had a great meal, and she said, well, perhaps people like me because I'm like the unknown ingredient on the plate of antipasto, the plate of antipasto that was just passing by. She said, "I'm strange but spicy." Well, to make her a little less strange, a short biography of Annie Proulx, very short. She was born in Connecticut in 1935 on the East Coast of the United States. She is the eldest of 5 daughters. Her father was a textile businessman of French-Canadian heritage. Her mother was a painter and a storyteller, and that has been of great influence on Annie Proulx. And she is a writer with a late vocation, as you call it. After a life of journalism, literally a life of journalism and a study of history, she debuted at 56 with a novel, and then immediately got the PEN/Faulkner Award, one of the great awards in American literature. Then came The Shipping News. That was a real breakthrough novel. It won 2 of the most prestigious prizes in America, the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award, and it got sold everywhere in the world and had great success. Mrs. Proulx has lived for 30 years in Vermont and then moved to Wyoming in the west of America. As she said, because the small New England woods, which in our eyes are vast and unending, make me feel claustrophobic. Well, in Wyoming, she lives in a small village of 60 people in the Rocky Mountains, and that's probably what she wants. Some short comments about Mrs. Proux's place in American literature. Well, as we all know, she's definitely not part of the Brat Pack, the yuppie writers who write about big cities. She's not a social satirist like Tom Wolfe or Don DeLillo or John Updike. She's not an ethnic American writer who writes about the experience of being in between 2 cultures, a very popular genre in modern American literature. And she's not a dirty realist, although her stories have a lot of dirt in them and a lot of realism. But she's different from, let's say, writers like Raymond Carver or Richard Ford, who write mainly about the middle classes and about suburbia, and that's definitely not the ground of Annie Proulx. You could call Annie Proulx the heir of Mark Twain, the American writer who also wrote tall tales about the American West and grotesques, 2 of the genres Annie Proulx works in, and who, and that is most important, also had a great sense of humor. Some examples of this great sense of humor are to be found in Close Range. There is the tractor that talks about its love for people in a story. There is Jesus, who is called by one of the figures in the stories the original rodeo cowboy, and he has the scripture text to prove that. It says so in the Bible, he says. Then there is the humorous idiom, which are many examples, varying from "that don't mean pig pee," or "Neelis was shot through the throat, and though he did not die, he wasn't much good for yodeling." And then there is the irony of Annie Proulx. Take the end of the story, "People in Hell Just Want a Drink of Water," great title, by the way, which says, well, we are in the new millennium, and such desperate things, as we read in the story, are no longer happen. If you believe that is the last sentence, you'll believe anything. And the last example, there is a 2-page story in Close Range, 55 miles to the gas pump, about a serial killer. And the last sentence of that story is, "When you live a long way out, you make your own fun." Annie Proulx changes with every book, and that makes her very hard to pin down. At this moment, we could say that she is a great Western writer who goes against the romantic myth of the West, which in Holland we mainly know from films, Westerns, of course, with John Wayne or without John Wayne, and comic strips like Lucky Luke, very popular Belgian strip which gets read in the Netherlands. can recommend it to everyone. This one is Barbed Wire in the Prairie, and this one is the Black Hills, which is not in South Dakota, but is about Wyoming. That's our picture of the West, a romantic place filled with heroes, but also criminals who are romantic. Everything in the West is terrific. That is not the picture Annie Proulx paints of the West. She paints a harsh world, a rugged place, in which there are mainly struggling farmers, loser cowboys, and very, very, very unheroic violence. And Annie Proulx is probably, as far as I can see, as far as I've read, the first woman writer to really tackle the West. The Western has always been a sort of man's ground. The great directors of Westerns are men. The great writers like Larry McMurtry or whoever in America writes Westerns. They are mainly men, but Annie Proulx is a woman, and she writes about the West. She has invaded this, this territory, you could say. And in that respect, she's like a great folk heroine of the West, Calamity Jane, who, by the way, we all know from Lucky Luke. She drew faster, she was stronger, she drank harder, and she was twice as intelligent as all her fellow cowboys and all outlaws. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Annie Proulx, the Calamity Jane of American literature.
Calamity Jane was definitely a Wyoming girl. I want to say thank you to all of the people, from my publisher to the old friends at the John Adams Institute who asked me here today. It's lovely to be back again. 3 years after the first time I was here, when I swore that I would not come back again until I could at least speak a few words of Dutch. Unfortunately, I haven't reached that point yet. Another 3 years are needed, at least. Before I'm going to talk a little bit about what's involved in writing this kind of story. And I want to begin with talking about the title. In this country, the Dutch translation has a different title than the American and UK editions. It's called The Governors of Wyoming here, which is the name of one of the stories, in fact, one of the minor stories. And in a sense, that skews the meaning of the book. The original title was Close Range, and that was the original cover. Close Range has several meanings, one of them a private meaning for me and another private meaning for Westerners, and talk a little about that. Everyone knows the expression of the open range. That was the great days of the West when the Texas trail drivers drove those immense herds of cattle up from Texas to the lush grazing lands of Wyoming and Montana. And in those days, open range meant that there were no fences at all. Everything was open. The cattle herds all mixed on this open range, and they had yearly roundups to sort out the cattle out of hundreds and thousands of cattle from many ranch owners. The great roundup, a cooperative effort by all of the cowboys riding for that particular brand. Sort them all out, brand them, and release them again, or drive them to market depending on what the season was. In the 1880s, barbed wire was introduced, and the range began to be fenced very, very quickly. First, what was fenced were the holdings of small ranchers and farmers along the trail so that the cattle wouldn't stray off the trail and ruin their gardens and their fields. And then the land holdings in the north, in Montana and Wyoming themselves, began to be fenced off. The day of the open range, the day of the cowboy, the day of the free trail and the free grass lasted 15 years. That's as long as there were really cowboys and a real cowboy culture in the West. From those 15 years, we have built this enormous mythological structure that is carried by everyone in the country. And the days of the closed range, or as they say in Wyoming, close range, began with the fencing. It was the end of an era. It was the parceling out of land. It was the fragmenting of an immense grassy plain, and it has great meaning in the West to say close range. It means sorrow for that which is gone. It means an allegiance to the old traditional open range, and one can certainly feel badly that it no longer exists, because with it went a kind of work community. But for the novelist or for the short story writer, it has another meaning. It has that meaning of being intensely close to something, close range. He shot at close range. The two of them talked at close range. This kind of thing, this intimate, face-to-face, not always comfortable situation when you're close range to someone as you are now sitting next to perhaps a stranger. This intimacy can be extended to the shape of the short story. The short story itself is a close range kind of writing. You don't have the distance and expansiveness of the novel. You don't have room to roll over and scratch your fleas. With the brevity and the intensity of a short story, you are at close range and you're dealing with characters who must function within a very small form. That's why the novel, there you see, the short stories are called close range. This collection really has many meanings. There's another meaning to close range in this particular context, and that is they're contemporary stories. What I'm playing with here, one of the things that I'm interested in, is taking that overriding immense mythology of the West and the cowboy life and tweaking it a little, so that what we have here are a lot of rather grim or at least hard stories about not having many chances in life to do things in contemporary Wyoming. So there's this element of time that's also dealt with here. We're talking about now when we're talking about the past as well, so that there's this constant back and forth between contemporary events and the old mythological past. And this is very fun to play with back and forth. So these stories about contemporary Wyoming, for the most part, and the enclosing fences of tradition, the landscape with its long sight lines, authority, restraint, class, limited economic opportunities, all of this is combines in popular thinking to a kind of half-wild freedom. But that landscape, that fenced landscape that is there now, not all of those fences are barbed wire or buck fence. Those fences are fences of the mind and fences of opportunity as well, and that forms part of this collection. These stories grew from not only from observation and listening and hanging out in Western bars and talking with people, but also from 5 years of clipping Wyoming newspapers and filing the clippings under such headings as the BLM, the Bureau of Land Management, misadventure, ranches, wildlife, domestic abuse, wildfires, train wrecks, roads, all of these things. And the way I usually approach the background for a short story or a novel is to drift around, listening and looking and just observing, but also by reading lots of different newspapers on an area. I usually will put in 2 or 3 years at least on just reading the newspapers. For the shipping news, I read a large variety of Newfoundland and Canadian newspapers for years, and again formed a large clipping file. And this sort of stuff, reading through it and just literally rolling in it for a long time gives you a sense of what's happening, who's doing what, how they're doing it, what people are thinking about things. So my approach is hardly adventurous and rare, and I continue to do that with everything. There's another aspect of these short stories that concerns me, and that is that they are stories about a particular place and a particular time. Almost everything I write is based on this approach. The physical geography, the landscape interests me very much, and that's what I deal with first. I get that in my mind, what the climate is, what the prevailing weather is, whether the wind blows fiercely or gently, whether it's steady or sporadic, what kind of rocks there are in the mountains or what kind of soil, all of these things, the plant life, the insect life, what animals are there, who hunts or why they don't or do. From that, I can draw conclusions or observations about the economic foundation of this area, how people made their livings from the time the first people came into this place, what traditions were established, how those traditions have persisted or undermined the current situation, how people came to define themselves, to identify themselves as persons of this region. Those of you who read history will recognize that this is hardly an original approach. It's the Anau school, made famous by Fernand Braudel and Loa Ledory, the discovery of looking at physical geography as the road to opening windows on the cultural landscape, the lives of people. And that is my approach. One can carry that to the rural world, which is the world I write about. And the rural world is a strange world indeed, because it is the most traditional and the most conservative of worlds. I look particularly at North America, Canadian and United Statesian rural communities. I haven't gotten to Mexico yet. But what I'm doing is charting a series of stories in some very, very different rural communities. The fishing outports of Newfoundland, the hill dairy farms of northern New England, the ranch life of Wyoming, and I'm working on the high plains windmills of Oklahoma and Texas at the moment. Very interesting. But what captures my attention is the moment, the time, sometimes the space of only a few years when the economic tradition of a region built on its geography and climate starts to fall apart under the pressure of global changes, population habits, entrepreneurial factors that sometimes begin continents away. And the little waves that wash against the shores of these rural, isolated, apparently changeless communities are affected. And this seizes my imagination. For me, this is where everything begins, that moment of change, those little thin years where the traditional is undermined, where the new place is not discerned, where there is nothing to turn to if you're in a rural area that has forever fished or forever ranched, and it begins to go. What do you do if you are just an individual there? And that is, as boring as it may sound, always the point that interests me, and all of my writing looks at that point, the point of dissolution, the place where we are halfway across the tightrope wire, the balance point, the falling from the wire. So there is that larger dimension. What I'm going to do today is read two of the shorter stories, because the long ones are too long and the short ones are too short to stand all alone. And I think then we'll just go to questions that might apply. The first story I'm going to read is called Job History, and essentially I also tend to look when I'm constructing a story or a novel in my mind. I'm concerned with lives usually 2 or 3 generations, but also as if you had thousands of small short threads all crunched into a ball or a clot and pulled one out, that kind of little thread, a life. It's the birth of the person, the progress or passage of time for them, and the end, in a dispassionate way, is also my modus operandi. And job history is the kind of life that someone who grew up in a place with very restricted economic opportunities, what kind of career would they have? What were the chances of commercial success, of individual expression, of self-identification, of freedom, of all of those things that fall so lightly from our lips when we speak of cultural identity. So this is what a life might have been like for a particular person in Wyoming. There is, of course, no particular person, but it's a fictional character. Leland Lee is born at home in Cora, Wyoming, November 17, 1947, the youngest of 6. In the 1950s, his parents moved to Unique when his mother inherits a small dog-bone ranch. The ranch lies a few miles outside town. They raise sheep, a few chickens, and some hogs. The father is irascible, and as soon as they can, the older children disperse. Leland can sing That Doggie in the Window all the way through. His father strikes him with a fly swatter and tells him to shut up. There's no news on the radio. A blizzard has knocked out the power. Leland's face shows heavy bone from his mother's side. His neck is thick and his red gold hair plastered down in bangs. Even as a child, his eyes are as pouchy as those of a middle-aged alcoholic, the brows rod straight above wandering, out-of-line eyes. His nose lies broad and close to his face. His mouth seems to have been cut with a single chisel blow into easy flesh. In the 5th grade, horsing around with friends, he falls off the school's fire escape and breaks his pelvis. He is in a body cast for 3 months. On the news, an announcer says that the average American eats 8.6 pounds of margarine a year, but only 8.3 pounds of butter. He never forgets this statistic. When Leland is 17, he marries Laurie Bovey. They quit school. Laurie is pregnant, and Leland is proud of this. His pelvis gives him no trouble. She is a year younger than he, with an undistinguished oval face, hair of medium length. She is a little stout, but looks a confection in pastel sweater sets. Leland and his mother fight over this marriage, and Leland leaves the ranch. He takes a job pumping gas at Egg's service station. Ed Egg says, "You may fire when ready, Gridley," and laughs. The station stands at the junction of Highway 16 and a county road. Highway 16 is the main tourist road to Yellowstone. Leland buys Laurie's father's old truck for $50, and Ed rebuilds the engine. Vietnam and Selma, Alabama are on the news. The federal highway program puts through the new 4-lane interstate 40 miles south of Highway 16, and parallel with it, overnight, the tourist business in Unique falls flat. One day, 100 cars stop for gas and oil, hamburgers, cold soda. The next day, only 2 cars pull in, both driven by locals asking how business is. In a few months, there is a for sale sign on the inside window of the service station. Ed Egg gets drunk and, driving at speed, hits 2 steers on the county road. Leland joins the Army, puts in for the motor pool. He is stationed in Germany for 6 years and never learns a word of the language. He comes back to Wyoming heavier, moodier. He works with the snow fence crew during spring and summer, and then moves Laurie and the children, the boy and a new baby girl, to Casper, where he drives oil trucks. They live in a house trailer on Poison Spider Road, jammed between 2 rioting neighbors. On the news, they hear that an enormous diamond has been discovered somewhere. The second girl is born. Leland can't seem to get ahead with the oil company dispatcher. After a year, they move back to Unique. Leland and his mother make up their differences. Laurie is good at saving money, and she has put aside a small nest egg. They set up in business for themselves. Leland believes people will be glad to trade at a local ranch supply store that saves a long drive into town. He rents the service station from Mrs. Egg, who has not been able to sell it after Ed's death. They spruce it up, Leland doing all the carpenter work, Laurie painting the interior and exterior. On the side, Leland raises hogs with his father. His father was born and raised in Iowa, and he knows hogs. It becomes clear that people relish the long drive to a bigger town where they can see something different, buy fancy groceries, clothing, bakery goods, as well as ranch supplies. One intensely cold winter, when everything freezes from God to gizzard, Leland and his father lose 112 hogs. They sell out. 18 months later, the ranch supply business goes under. The new color television set goes back to the store. After the bankruptcy proceedings, Leland finds work on a road construction crew. He's always out of town, it seems, but back often enough for what he calls a good ride, and so makes Laurie pregnant again. Before the baby is born, he quits the road crew. He can't seem to get along with the foreman. No one can, and turnover is high. On his truck radio, he hears that hundreds of religious cult members have swallowed Kool-Aid and cyanide. Leland takes a job at Tongue River Meat Locker and Processing. Old man Proulx owns the business. Leland is the only employee. He has an aptitude for sizing up and cutting large animals. He likes wrapping the tidy packages, the smell of damp bone and chill. He can throw his cleaver unerringly, and when mice run along the wall, they do not run far if Leland is there. After months of discussion with old man Proulx, Leland and Laurie sign a 10-year lease on the meat locker operation. Their oldest boy graduates from high school, the first in the family to do so, and he joins the Army. He signs up for 6 years. There is something on the news about school lunches, and ketchup is classed as a vegetable. Old man Proulx moves to Albuquerque. The economy takes a dive. The news is full of talk about recession and unemployment. Thrifty owners of small ranches go back to doing their own butchering, cutting, and freezing. The meat locker lease payments are high and electricity jumps up. Leland and Laurie have to give up the business. Old man Proulx returns from Albuquerque. There are bad feelings. It didn't work out, Leland says, and that's the truth of it. It seems like a good time to try another place. The family moves to Thermopolis, where Leland finds a temporary job at a local meat locker during hunting season. A hunter from Des Moines, not far from where Leland's father was born, tips him $100 when he loads packages of frozen elk and the elk's head onto the man's single-engine plane. The man has been drinking. The plane goes down in the Medicine Bow Range in the southeast. During this long winter, Leland is out of work and stays home with the baby. Laurie works in the school cafeteria. The baby is a real crier, and Leland quiets him down with spoons full of beer. In the spring, they move back to Unique, and Leland tries truck driving again, this time long-distance rigs, coast-to-coast journeys that take him away 2-3 months at a time. He travels all over the continent, to Texas, Alaska, Montreal, to Corpus Christi. He says every place is the same. Laurie works now in the kitchen of the High-Low Cafe in Unique. The ownership of the cafe changes 3 times in 2 years. West Clinker, an elderly rancher, eats 3 meals a day at the High-Low. He is sweet on Laurie. He reads her an article from the newspaper. A strange hole has appeared in the ozone layer. He confuses ozone with oxygen. One night while Leland is somewhere on the East Coast, the baby goes into convulsions following a week's illness of fever and cough. Laurie makes a frightening drive over icy roads to the distant hospital. The baby survives, but he is slow. Laurie starts a medical emergency response group in Unique. 3 women and 2 men sign up to take the first aid course. They drive 100 miles to the first aid classes. Only 2 of them pass the test on the first try. Laurie is one of the 2. The other is Stuttering Bob, an old bachelor. One of the failed students says Stuttering Bob has nothing to do but study the first aid manual as he enjoys the leisured life that goes with a monthly Social Security check. Leland quits driving trucks and again tries raising hogs with his father on the old ranch. He becomes a volunteer fireman and is at the bad February fire that kills 2 children. It takes the fire truck 3 hours to get into the ranch through the wind-drifted snow. The family is related to Laurie. When something inside explodes, Leland tells, an object flies out of the house and strikes the fire engine hood. It is a Nintendo player and not even charred. Stuttering Bob has cousins in Muncie, Indiana. One of the cousins works at the Muncie Medical Center. The cousin arranges for the medical center to donate an old ambulance to the Unique Rescue Squad, although they had intended to give it to a group in Mississippi. Bob's cousin, who has been to Unique, persuades them. Bob is afraid to drive through congested cities, so Leland and Laurie take a series of buses to Muncie to pick up the vehicle. It is their first vacation. They take the youngest boy with them. On the return trip, Laurie leaves her purse on a chair in a restaurant. The gas money for the return trip is in the purse. They go back to the restaurant, wild with anxiety. The purse has been turned in and there is nothing missing. Laurie and Leland talk about the goodness of people, even strangers. In their absence, Stuttering Bob is elected president of the rescue squad. A husband and wife from California move to Unique and open a taxidermy business. They say they are artists and arrange the animals in unusual poses. Laurie gets work cleaning their workshop. The locals make jokes about the coyote in the window, posed, lifting a leg against sagebrush where a trap is set. The taxidermists hold out for almost 2 years and then move to Oregon. Leland's and Laurie's oldest son telephones from overseas. He is making a career of the service. Leland's father dies, and they discover the hog business is deeply in debt, the ranch twice mortgaged. The ranch is sold to pay off debts. Leland's mother moves in with them. Leland continues long-distance truck driving. His mother watches television all day. Sometimes she sits in Laurie's kitchen saying almost nothing, picking small stones from dried beans. The youngest daughter babysits. One night on the way home, her employer feels her small breasts and asks her to squeeze his penis because, he says, she ate the piece of chocolate cake he was saving. She does it, but runs crying into the house and tells Laurie, who advises her to keep quiet and stay home from now on. The man is Leland's friend. They hunt elk and antelope together. Leland quits truck driving. Laurie has saved a little money. Once more, they decide to go into business for themselves. They lease the old gas station where Leland had his first job and where they tried the ranch supply store. Now it is a gas station again, but also a convenience store. They try surefire gimmicks, plastic come-on banners that pop and tear in the wind, free ice cream cones with every fill-up, prize drawings. This boy is discharged from the service and will not say why, but Leland knows it is chemical substances, drugs. Thank you. Ooh. They hold on for a year, and then Leland admits it hasn't worked out. And he is right. He is depressed for days when San Francisco beats Denver in the Super Bowl. Their oldest boy is discharged from the service and will not say why, but Leland knows it is chemical substances, drugs. Leland is driving long-distance trucks again, despite his back pain. The oldest son is at home working on a ranch hand in Ulm. Leland studies him, looking for signs of addiction. The son's eyes are always red and streaming. The worst year comes. Leland's mother dies. Leland hurts his back. And in the same week, Laurie learns that she has breast cancer and is pregnant again. She is 46. Laurie's doctor advises an abortion. Laurie refuses. The oldest son is discovered to have an allergy to horses and quits the ranch job. He tells Leland he wants to try raising hogs. Pork prices are high. For a few days, Leland is excited. He can see it clearly. Leland, Lee, and son, livestock. But the son changes his mind when a friend he knows in the service comes by on a motorcycle. The next morning, both of them leave for Phoenix. Laurie spontaneously aborts in the 5th month of the pregnancy, and then the cancer burns her up. Leland is at the hospital with her every day. Laurie dies. The daughters, both married now, curse Leland. No one knows how to reach the oldest son, and he misses the funeral. The youngest boy cries inconsolably. They decide he will live in Billings, Montana, with the oldest sister who is expecting her first child. 2 springs after Laurie's death, a middle-aged woman from Ohio buys the cafe, paints it orange, renames it Unique Eats, and hires Leland to cook. He is good with meat, knows how to choose the best cuts and grill or do them chicken fried style to perfection. He has never cooked anything at home, and everyone is surprised at this long-hidden skill. The oldest son comes back, and next year they plan to lease the old gas station and convert it to a motorcycle repair shop and steakhouse. Nobody has time to listen to the news. I just discovered all the watering glasses underneath. This last story I'm going to read is The Blood Bay, which was a very amusing story to write. Folklore and folk tales play a large part in this collection, and they're just stitched all the way through from the Icelandic story of Porgir's Bull to the talking tractor actually came from a Grimm and Anderson story where a prince is imprisoned in an oven and speaks to the handsome goose girl. And this, there are so many odd folktale connections that I can't begin to think of them all, but there is in every stock-raising country in the world a story about a traveler who stops and asks for shelter for the night from a farmer who has a cow or a calf or a sheep or whatever, and That animal is kept in the kitchen in the old European tradition, because we're using a European version here. And the traveler lies down on the floor, and the next morning it appears that something frightful has happened to the traveler. So adapting this very old story to Wyoming was rather amusing for me. I was in a tiny little bar in the town of Arvada between Spotted Horse and Clearmont. And the proprietor of this bar is an old friend of mine, a fellow named Buzzy Malley, interesting man who is in the thick of the ranch business. And Buzzy said to me one day, you know, there's just one thing I wish you'd do. I wish you would write a story sometime about Arvada. And the story that came out was this one. Arvada used to be known as Suggs. It played a large part in the famous Johnson County War, which is the basis for 98% of all Westerns. It's where the small nester or rancher is at war with the big rancher, and someone is shot in the back from a distance. All of this began in Wyoming, that Johnson County War. The aftermath of the Johnson County War, the big ranchers who had attacked the small ranchers were taken away down to Cheyenne and clapped into jail for a day or two. The populace was still enraged. People were riding to and fro, and there was still considerable shooting going on up in Johnson County. The governor of the state called for help from Washington, and federal troops were sent in a deliberately calculated act of racism to divert attention from the big rancher, small rancher confrontation. The governor asked for black troops, and black troops were sent in. And they were stationed in Buffalo, Wyoming. During one evening, a black sergeant took 4 of his men and rode up to Suggs, which was the red light district for this entire area. It was a cattle shipping town, and there was a mile-long strip down the middle of Suggs. Suggs, Arvada now has a population of 20 now, but in those days it had 1,000. And the whole main strip was lined with brothels and bars, and a very, very rowdy town it was. The sergeant and his 3 friends went up to Suggs, where the sergeant knew a certain prostitute whom he'd met in Texas, and they had a fine time at first. It led to gunfire. There was a full-scale race riot, and Suggs was shot up considerable. You can still see the bullet holes today. So with that in mind, I thought I would revert to the town's earlier character and call it Suggs again. And although we don't have shoot-ups and a race riot in it, it is connected with its colorful past in a very background way. So this is what came out, combining Suggs, Buzzy's desire for a story about the region, the strong ranch component, and the year in the late 19th century. This is what we end up with in the Blood Bay. The winter of 1886-87 was terrible. Every goddamn history of the High Plains says so. There were great stocks of cattle on overgrazed land during the droughty summer. Early wet snow froze hard, so the cattle could not break through the crust of the grass. Blizzards and freeze-eye cold followed, the gaunt bodies of cattle piling up in draws and coulees. A young Montana cowboy, somewhat vain, had skimped on coat and mittens and put all his wages into a fine pair of handmade boots. He crossed down into Wyoming territory thinking it would be warmer, for it was south of where he was. That night he froze to death on Powder River's bitter west bank, the stream of famous dimensions and direction, an inch deep, a mile wide, and she flows uphill from Texas. The next afternoon, 3 cowpunchers from the Box Spring outfit near Suggs rode past his corpse, blue as a whetstone and half buried in snow. They were savvy and salty. They wore blanket coats, woolly chaps, grease wool scarves tied over their hats and under their bristled chins, sheepskin mitts, and 2 of them were fortunate enough to park their feet in good boots and heavy socks. The third, dirt sheets, a cross-eyed drinker of hair oil, was all right on top, but his luck was running muddy near the bottom, no socks, and curl-toed boots cracked and holed. "That can of corned beef's wearing my size boots," Sheets said, and got off his horse for the first time that day. He pulled at the Montana cowboy's left boot, but it was frozen on. The right one didn't come off any easier. "Son of a sick steer in the snowbank," he said. "I'll cut 'em off and thaw 'em after supper." Sheets pulled out a bowie knife and sawed through Montana's shins just above the boot tops, put the booted feet in his saddlebags, admiring the tooled leather and top-stitched hearts and clubs. They rode on down the river looking for strays, found a dozen bogged in deep drifts, and lost most of the daylight getting them out. "Too late to try for the bunkhouse. Old man Grice's shack is somewheres up along. He's bound to have dried prunes or other dainties, or at least a hot stove." The temperature was dropping, so cold that spit crackled in the air, and a man didn't dare to piss for fear he'd be rooted fast until spring. They agreed it must be 40 below and more, the wind scything up a nice Wyoming howler. They found the shack 4 miles north. Old man Grice opened the door a crack. "Come on in, puncher. Puncher or rustler, I don't care. We'll put our horses up. Where's the barn?" "Barn? Never had one. There's a lean-to out there behind the wood pile. Should keep 'em from blowing away or maybe freezing. I got my 2 horses in here beside the dish cupboard. I pamper them babies something terrible. Sleep where you can find a space, but I'm telling you, don't bother my blood bay none. He will mull you up and spit you out. He's a spirited steed. Pull up a chair, boys, and have some of this son of a bitch stew, and I got plenty of conversation juice to wash it down. Hot biscuits just coming out of the oven." It was a fine evening. Eating, drinking, playing cards, swapping lies, the stove kicking out heat, old man Grice's spoiled horses sighing in comfort. The only disagreeable tone to the evening from the Waddy's point of view was the fact that their host cleaned them out, took them for $3.04. Around midnight, Grice blew out the lamp, got in his bunk, and the 3 punchers stretched out on the floor. Sheets set his trophies behind the stove, laid his head on his saddle, and went to sleep. He woke half an hour before daylight, recalled that it was his mother's birthday, and if he wanted to telegraph a filial sentiment to her, he would have to ride faster than chain lightning with a link snap, for the overland office closed at noon. He checked his grisly trophies, found them thawed, and pulled the boots and socks off the originals, drew them onto his own pedal extremities. He threw the bare Montana feet and his old boots in the corner near the dish cupboard, slipped out like a falling feather, saddled his horse, and rode away. The wind was low, and the fine cold air refreshed him. Old man Grice was up with the sun, grinding coffee beans and frying bacon. He glanced down at his rolled-up guests and said, "Coffee's ready." The blood bay stamped and kicked at something that looked like a man's foot. Old man Grice took a closer look. "There's a bad start to the day," he said. "It is a man's foot, and there's the other." He counted the sleeping guests. There were only 2 of them. "Wake up, survivors, for God's sake, wake up and get up." The two punchers rolled out, stared wild-eyed at the old man who was fairly frothing, pointing at the feet on the floor behind the blood bay. "He's 8 sheets. Oh, I knew he was a hard horse, but to eat a man whole. Oh, you savage bugger," he screamed at the blood bay and drove him out into the scorching cold. "You'll never eat human meat again. You'll sleep out with the blizzards and wolves, you hell-bound fiend." But secretly, he was pleased to own a horse with the sand to eat a raw cowboy. The leftover box spring riders were up and drinking coffee. They squinted at old man Grice and hitched at their gun belts. "Oh, boys, for God's sake, it was a terrible accident. I didn't know what a brute of an animal was that blood bay. Let's keep this to ourselves." Sheets was no prize, and I got 40 gold dollars says so, and the 3 and 4 bits I took off of you last night. Eat your bacon and don't make no trouble. There's enough trouble in the world without no more. No, they wouldn't make trouble, and they put the heavy money in their saddlebags, drank a last cup of hot coffee, saddled up, and rode out into the grinning morning. When they saw Sheets that night at the bunkhouse, they nodded, congratulated him on his mother's birthday, but said nothing about blood bays or $43 and 4 bits. The arithmetic stood comfortable.
Okay, is this working? Yes.
Yes, do have some water.
You need it.
I was going into a coughing fit. I'm sorry about that. This is a dry story.
Yeah, blood dry. Yeah. I'll put a few questions to you and then give it over to the floor for people who want to ask something. And I would like to begin with the sense of place that is always put to you. I mean, the question whether the sense of place influences your writing. A few years ago, you moved, as we heard, you moved from the East Coast to Wyoming. And the subject and the scenery of your stories and novels changed with that move, shifted with that move, you could say. Heart Songs is very much New England. The Shipping News is Newfoundland, still East Coast, Canada in this case. And now there is Close Range, which is very much set in the West. Do you have to live in the place you write about, is the first question. And are you some kind of a nomad pioneer who always moves on to a new, fresh country where you can set your stories?
All of the above. No, you don't have to live. You don't have to live in the place. In fact, I think it's probably a problem if you do. You're apt not to see the oddities of the place, the fresh eye, the sidelong glance, the observer's fresh take on things is really important. So in many senses, I do keep moving on. However, Wyoming is my writing place, and with the exception of that first collection of short stories, Heart Songs, which is the old word, by the way, for country western music. It used to be called Heart Songs. Everything that I've written, all of my fiction, has been written in Wyoming. Even when I lived in Vermont, Wyoming was and is my writing place. And again, it's because those long sight lines, being able to just stride out and think your way through knotty tangles in plots and characterization, it makes it a very easy place to write.
And so, how did you end up with Wyoming, or begin with Wyoming, because you were not born there? Or
I was not born there, no. When I was working on postcards. The character in Postcards is rooted in New England in those hill farms, but he moves across the country. And to write that book, I followed him across the country, as it were.
Literally.
Going, marking out the route he would have taken so I could get the geography right. And in the process of doing that, found myself again in Wyoming, where I had been and visited many times before without ever considering living there, and thought that it would be really a remarkably good place to spend time. And so later I did. I couldn't move out there while my mother was still alive, but 6 weeks after her death, I did move to Wyoming 5 or 6 years ago.
And I heard that your next novel will be about Texas and Oklahoma, but that does not mean that you're going to move there to, take in the rhythms of speech, the scenery and whatever.
No, I can do that in short visits. It's only 1,200 miles away, so
yeah.
It's a day and a half's drive. So it's much better for me to do it the same way that the Newfoundland book, Shipping News, was written. I made 10 trips to Newfoundland, sort of to a different area each time, just sliding along, hanging out, stopping where you feel like stopping, visiting graveyards and cafes.
In the reading you gave in Groningen, you were talking about the landscape in American literature and how, in a way it is neglected in modern literature, and how you would like to bring that back into American literature, the descriptions of the landscape, the way it influences people, it works out.
I don't think there was any zeal of wanting to bring it back because I don't think it's possible to recapture the past. I think the main point I was trying to make was that after World War II, our attitude toward the rural world, toward landscape, began to change. We have become very much an urban and suburban country, along with most of the world. And the attention paid to the country is very different now than it was. And this shows up in our literature, where very few writers use landscape description in any way but a decorative way that ornaments the story they're telling rather than moving it forward. So I think that was my main take, is observational rather than preacher-like.
But would you consider yourself then an old-fashioned writer in a way? Because
Yes.
you go back to this landscape and make it work in your
Absolutely,
books?
yes, I would. I'm probably writing in the 40s.
And what will your new book be about? Is that will that also be rooted in the landscape as much as Close Range? And will it be stories or will it be a novel?
I don't know yet. I'd gladly answer the question, but since I really haven't begun work because it's been a very busy year, it's premature
All
to
these
say.
kinds of readings.
Right, so I don't know.
You started out as a historian, as a history researcher, and as a journalist. And, we heard a little about how that influenced your writing. You were talking about the historians of the Annales school who do the same in history as you would like to do in your books. Do you think it makes one a better writer if one is schooled in history and in journalism? And do you have to have a knowledge of history to be a writer, and a society to be a writer? Isn't imagination enough?
I don't think imagination is enough. I think certainly it isn't for me. I think it's really important to know what you're writing about, the beyond the shape of the story and the construct of events in quick little lives that are in short stories. It's wonderful. It's intensely valuable to know what went before, how everything that lies beneath the surface appearance is. So as far as I'm personally concerned, I like to read literature that grasps the large picture, doesn't push your face into it as into a pie, but the stuff is there if you want it. I like that kind of thing very, very much.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so, yes, it's
And
important.
you yourself also like writers who do that, who are really rooted in history and
I do.
social studies.
I
in a
do,
way.
yes, very much.
What kind of writers would they be? I mean, in America, except for Cormac McCarthy, who we already heard about.
Yeah, you know, that's
It's a difficult question.
it's an impossible question. Actually, I was stuck on the tarmac in Seattle a few years ago, and the plane couldn't go because the wings had fallen off or something. And while they were bolting them back on, because this is a question that is frequently asked, I began to make a list. And by the time I'd finished that list and we took off,
The wings were sewed on.
it took, 15 minutes to read the list. And it's really very difficult to say, oh, my favorite writers are writers I admire, or so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so, because it changes every year. But I can say I certainly like Patrick White, the Australian writer. I like Orhan Pamuk. I like J.F. Powers in the States, a Minnesota writer, very little known in the States, and I don't think he's well known abroad either.
I don't know.
Who writes?
Probably me.
Who writes immensely sarcastic novels about Catholic priests who are spending their time in the most desolate and dismal of places, all of them. And they're all very middle class and like to spend their time watching football and playing cards. And he has a marvelous Father Al Fresco. And there's an old antelope that sleeps on a hillside near my house, whom we all call Al Fresco now in honor of this character. I can't answer the question.
You can't begin.
I can't begin.
In your novelist stories, there is a lot of America. I mean, it's all America and rooted in America.
Well, the Canadian bits are there, and some of them.
Which, some trips across the border. But is it your aim to show the world in your books how diverse America is? I'm thinking of the line of Ralph Waldo Emerson, who said, "America is a poem in our eyes, and we have to celebrate it," or something like that.
No, Walt Whitman had that approach as well, but I'm not so much concerned with this fantastic mythological thing called America, but very much more interested in the fragments of the country that are the rural portions of it, where country folk still live, where extremely rich people who've made an enormous amount of money in recent years from the stock market have bought second and third homes because they're there as well. And it's really rurality that interests me, small towns to some extent too. And I think that's simply because I'm afraid that I wouldn't be able to grasp a large place. It would be very difficult for me.
Mm-hmm.
It would turn in, the vogue now is for very, very large books, very, very fat books in the States anyway. I'm afraid I would end up writing something like that.
Like that. And well, in many of your stories, you don't exactly celebrate American life because they're mainly about. Yeah, it seems to turn up sometimes. It's about the loss of culture, about civilization in very rough places. It's about the loss of traditional ways. We heard that you were mainly interested in moments of change. It's about urbanization and the end of farming. In fact, it's quite a bleak view of America you give. You have, are things going wrong in America? Are you pessimistic about the country? Because you don't seem to give a verdict on it. And
right.
You don't have to, of course, but you're sort of like an historian.
Right.
recording these moments of
quite
change.
Right. Thank you. It's not my business to give a verdict to say that things are going from bad to worse. I don't think they are. It's like the idea of progress. It sounds pretty good until you start thinking about what does that mean. There's an implicit sense of goal in the idea of progress. There's an implicit sense of things are not so good now, but we're going to get there. So I avoid that kind of thing. I'm finding out more than saying how it is. I'm asking, how is it? Mm-hmm. It's just the observational eye put down on paper with a story to make it readable, mm-hmm. I guess.
And it's again the eye of the historian then, or the...
I like to think so. Not a particularly good historian, rather a sloppy one, because I can be extremely selective about the material. I don't have to hew to the truth and the solid facts, which is one of the joys of fiction. You can lie as much as you like. And if something doesn't work for the theory, that's all right.
You write all kinds of things, like short stories. You have paragraphs in your book which are kind of short stories. There is Accordion Crimes, which consists of, in a way of many short stories within a bigger novel. What is your favorite genre? Is it the novel? Is the novel the real thing, or is it the short story, or is it both? Or?
I'm asking myself that question this past year. I hadn't written short stories for about 10 years, really, until this collection. And I thought of myself as a novelist, and then I was asked to do a short story for the Nature Conservancy collection, and the Half-Skinned Steer came from that. And I had such a good time writing that story that I thought I'd like to do more. And it occurred to me that I might, at that point, do ranching community, i.e. Wyoming. Asked my publisher if I could take a leave of absence from the novel that I owed them, and did in fact spend 15 months on these stories. I found them very rewarding to write. It was interesting, it was exciting, it was never drudgery. It was very pleasurable, and I felt that I'd made some progress in this medium. The short story medium is a difficult medium. Short stories are not particularly honored anywhere these days as a literary genre. They're hard to do well. They take a lot of time. To write these 11 stories took more time than it would have to have written a novel twice the number of pages. And this is the complaint of short story writers, that they're time-consuming, unrewarding monetarily. They are not widely read, et cetera, but when you start doing them, they're extraordinarily interesting. They're demanding. You're on your mettle. And I love writing short stories. On the other hand, my publisher would like me to write novels.
Write a novel
so
for exactly those reasons.
Yeah, so there we are. I don't know.
Okay. Well, I would like to ask the room whether there are any questions for Mrs. Proulx. Yeah. Can you walk to the microphone? I think that's best.
My question is related to your comment, your initial comment on the effects of global change in rural areas. I would like to know your thoughts on American rural militia groups, which are fearing the New World Order and are defending themselves against a possible attack of the UN. And I would just like to know whether you think these people have legitimate concerns which are unaddressed, or whether they're just plain mad.
Well, it's opinions we want now.
Yes, and I'm not a person of strong opinions. I'm a professional observer, so I prevent myself from having opinions, or if I have them, I keep them to myself most often. But this is a very curious question, and it's curious in more ways than you can possibly imagine. I live in Wyoming, which does not have a large number of survivalist groups, but it has some. There is a person in my town who comes from Missouri, I think, belongs to a very peculiar end-of-the-world religious group and drives this vast, wide Hummer with a 38 millimeter cannon mounted on top. This is America. You can do this. And is extremely affable, gets along wonderfully well with everybody in town, is very jolly in demeanor, and he's likable. He's extremely likable. Well, who knows what he's like when he's at home? I mean, in public, he's very likable. So you have this. Idaho, the state next to me, and Montana have many of these groups, some of whom have achieved international infamy. And I also have another neighbor, a rancher in the little town I live in, who is afraid that Y2K is going to come thundering down in January, that there will be riots in the streets, that the electricity will fail, that people from the city of Laramie of 25,000 will come roaring up into the mountains and seize his stronghold. So I know that he has bought a number of electric generators and many canned goods and bags of rice and that sort of thing, and he is ready. His preparations are made, and there's nothing that can happen that will dislodge him. He's all right, and when I say ready, that has the full scope of readiness implied.
Less than 70 days to go.
Right. He has plenty of boxes of ammunition and that sort of thing, you can be sure. So there is that mentality out there of making a defense against the world. I think too that rural places, the more rugged rural places, attract people who don't get on in tighter situations with people close around them. They don't like urban and suburban and larger communities. That the Vietnam War, when I was living in Vermont, there were a number of people in Vermont, Vietnam veterans, who came back and who lived alone way in the back of the woods and had some very peculiar habits. There was one man who, I don't know what his private fears were, but I do know that he had tin cans scattered throughout the woods and turned upside down, and every tin can had underneath it a knife. And I don't know what he was expecting, but he wanted to be able to run into the woods and get his weapons, or if he was forced to hide there. So this stuff is there, and I consider it my business not to have an opinion on whether it's really wacko Nutsville or whether it's an indication of some subterranean malaise that needs examination. So I'll leave it to you to answer the question yourself.
Okay. Is there another question? Yes, in the back of the room.
I just had a question regarding the story about the two cowboys in Brokeback Mountain. Considering the death of Matthew Shepard in a nearby state to you, Montana, I was wondering what the reaction has been in the West to that story.
Wow.
Could you explain about Matthew Shepard for a moment?
I will.
Not everybody will know
Yes.
him, I guess.
Matthew Shepard was a young gay man who was not killed in Montana, but 25 miles from where I live in the town of Laramie, the most liberal, the most progressive of all Wyoming towns. It's the university town. He was, and I I can't say for sure. The trial of the second killer is taking place now. And in fact, I was called for jury duty to this trial and only heard on Friday last that I could come to Holland and not have to report for jury duty, for they had the jury selected. Matthew Shepard was a Wyoming native, a very slender, small youth who was gay. He was in a bar in downtown Laramie a year and a month ago and was decoyed, apparently, out of the bar into a vehicle with two men who pretended to be gay, who took him just outside of town, tied him to a buck fence, which is a wooden fence with cross members supporting it, and very savagely beat him to death, left him there to die on the fence. He was not found for 18 hours, and it was very, very cold, so he froze as well. He lingered for a few days in Fort Collins, Colorado hospital, and then finally died. The town of Laramie was turned upside down. The entire state of Wyoming felt that an enormous, terrible thing had happened to them, that they were being pilloried for a kind of homophobic attitude. They felt that they had to show that they were otherwise in Laramie, so there were parades, there were vigils, there were protestations that we are not like this, we are not truly homophobic. All over the state there were these outbursts of denial that this was the prevailing sentiment. The story about the two cowboys in here was published a year before Matthew Shepard met his fate. And there is homophobia in Wyoming. There is definitely homophobia in Wyoming, and that's why I wrote that kind of story. The two characters themselves are the most homophobic of all of them in here. Their own lives are ruined by homophobia. But there are pockets of enlightenment. There are people all over the state who feel enormously badly about this, who see it as a smirch on the reputation of the state. There are others who think that, well, too bad, but that's what happens if you're gay. It's a very tricky question. How do people in Wyoming feel? Are they changing their attitude? Have they learned tolerance from this? Is Wyoming a special place for homophobia? No. It's in many, many, many states and communities. So that's really not an answer to your question so much as it is a comment on the situation which remains unresolved. My personal feeling is that people in Wyoming have been enormously moved by this terrible event to re-examine their own feelings and thoughts on the subject, and that in the long run perhaps will come more tolerance. At least that is my hope.
If I may just follow that up for a moment, because my question was actually just less about Matthew Shepard and more the personal reaction from people in Wyoming to that particular story that you've written. I mean, were they, some of them horrified, two cowboys, gay, or was there much more acceptance than you would have expected?
Let me put it this way. I've had several hundred letters from men in Wyoming who work on ranches saying that's how it is for me. I've lived a life of secrecy here. I've had drawings, I've had photographs, I've had bags of rice, the most diverse pouring out of extraordinarily moving and heartfelt response to that story. People are glad that it was written, and many, 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 many men felt it was written for them personally. I have had not one single letter who said, what a rotten story and what a disgusting person you are for writing it. Not one. People may say otherwise verbally, but I haven't heard it yet. And I've only had to conclude that there are many people in Wyoming communities leading very quiet, very careful lives. I know a number of gay men in the state who are extremely cautious. Does that get any closer to the answer of the question? Thank you.
I'm sure that there are lots of more questions, but I'm afraid we have to stop because there is another performance or program coming in after us, so we can't, unfortunately, go on. Thank you very much, Annie Proulx.
Thank you all for
professional
coming.
observer.